Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's show, we're going to be talking about an issue that's top of mind for a lot of Canadians, rising prices and inflation. As everyone knows, the price of everything from food to gasoline to housing has been going through the roof, and a lot of Canadians are struggling just to make ends meet. And to talk about this very important issue, I'm very pleased to be welcoming Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who's written a great deal about this topic. Philip, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Aaron. Thanks for having me on.
Now, Philip, as I said, you've written a great deal about this, but I wanted to sort of start at the beginning. Of course, a lot of Canadians are experiencing these increases in prices. They're frustrated by them. Some of them are having a very hard time making ends meet. But what is the fundamental cause here? This is an issue that is plaguing not just Canada, but countries around the world. What, in your view, is the cause of all this rapid inflation?
Well, fundamentally, inflation is an imbalance between supply and demand. During the pandemic, governments around the world stoked demand through excessive monetary and fiscal stimulus. But at the same time, and we've just come to understand this more coming out of the pandemic, the supply side of the economy clearly was damaged during the pandemic as well. This is most clear, it's becoming obvious in the labor markets, but other things such as global supply chains with China. More recently, the supply of energy has been disrupted because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's any number of factors that have raised demand beyond what the economy or the world economy is capable of supplying these days.
Is it fair to say that in this case, because of course inflation has existed at various times, but the amount of the inflation, the speed at which we're seeing it increase right now, is it a function of the unique circumstances of the pandemic? That is to say, you had, as you said, governments pouring out a lot of money into the economy, so you're spiking demand on that side, and then supply challenges. So rather than just demand rising and supply even staying the same, supply has actually been impacted in a negative way. So is it fair to say those two things combined are what's leading to particularly high inflation right now?
Well, that's a good way of putting it. But we've seen this problem has been building even since before the pandemic. I mean, we've seen for 10 years now, we've been relying on especially easy money monetary policy to stoke growth. And over that same period, we've been ignoring the supply side. And organizations such as the Bank for International Settlements, what's often called the central bank to central banks, they've been warning governments to pay more attention to stimulating the supply side. The problem we have now is that in the very short term, inflation has blown through the roof. We're looking at 8% plus. And in the supply side, supply side takes a long time to correct. So you can't really fix it. So the only thing left to do in the short term is to tamp down demand. And given the fiscal deficits that we're running, the only game in town at this point is raising interest rates. And that's why the ball is very much in the Bank of Canada's court to rein in inflation in the short term.
And let's talk about the Bank of Canada a little bit. I'm not sure a lot of viewers might fully appreciate the role of the central bank. What is the role of the central bank when it comes to managing inflation?
Well, the central bank has a mandate to keep inflation at 2%. They have a negotiated mandate with the federal government. The federal government and other levels of government can do things to help inflation in the longer term. They could help improve the potential of the economy by, for example, freeing up interprovincial trade. People have been calling for that for a long time. We could have done things to improve housing supply for over a decade now. So governments, are not blameless in this, but in the very short term, the Bank of Canada alone has one mandate, and that's to fix inflation. No other organization in the federal government or in Canada has only one mandate, and that is to control prices, and that's the Bank of Canada. So that's why the Bank of Canada has to take the lead on this.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in the way they control inflation is by changes to the interest rate?
That's the primary one. I mean, there's other things. Governments could lower their deficits. That would certainly help. The Bank of Canada could have urged governments to be more creative in boosting potential. But as I say, that's going to take years before it has any impact. So in the very short term, given the failure of governments to act, the only thing that can be done in the very short term to rein in prices is to raise interest rates.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking inflation with Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Philip, we were talking about the Bank of Canada before the break and their role in controlling inflation. You've written at great length about the bank's failures to anticipate, inflation growth. They argued for a long time it was transitory. I think it's fair to say your predictions were right and they were wrong. What fundamentally, Philip, do you think that the bank got wrong in not acting sooner on inflation?
Well, I don't think they appreciated fully the amount of stimulus that governments had injected into the economy, even before the pandemic, and then especially during the pandemic. For example, since 2015, the Canadian housing market has clearly taken off. There's been a lot of asset price inflation, even if that doesn't show up in the conventional measure of inflation, which is the consumer price index. So there were warning signs there that demand, especially in certain markets, commodity and asset markets, was overheating because of low interest rates during that period. At the same time, it was also clear that governments were not doing enough to boost the supply side. The Bank of Canada could have been more forceful even before the pandemic in telling governments, we're not going to keep interest rates low for you and make it easy for you to run deficits unless you take more proactive steps to boost the supply side. Then the pandemic comes along and we just absolutely go crazy with record deficits, with zero interest rates. We're stimulating all over the place. The money supply is exploding at 30%, and the bank doesn't properly estimate that this is going to overheat demand. And they also underestimate the negative impact of the pandemic had in supply, disrupting supply chains, disrupting the labor market in particular. So they just completely underestimated the amount of stimulus they were injecting into the economy on the demand side. And at the same time, they underestimated the amount of disruption to the supply side being caused by the pandemic. Even then, when inflation first took off in 2021, they made the mistake of saying, oh, it's just transitory problems to supply and it'll go away. And finally, the last mistake the bank made was in January of this year, 2022. They finally acknowledged the economy had hit full employment, that demand was equal to or exceeding supply, and they still didn't raise interest rates. Even at that point, the Bank of England, for example, had started raising interest rates last December. So there were precedents. It wasn't, like no central bank was failed to acknowledge that there was a building of inflationary pressures and it needed higher interest rates, and yet the bank was still unwilling to raise rates, which is why they fell behind the curve, and now we're seeing these very large full percentage point hikes as the Bank of Canada scrambles to catch up.
I want to reach back to something you said earlier in a second, but first I want to pick up on that point about the Bank of England. So you're saying that even if many central banks were slow off the mark, the Bank of Canada in particular was even slower off the mark than some of our peer countries?
That's right. The Bank of Canada, like the Federal Reserve Board, were not as quick as the Bank of England. On the other hand, and I wouldn't boast about this too much, I mean, the European Central Bank finally got around to raising interest rates, I believe just last week or in the past month anyways. And that's the first time they've raised interest rates, I believe, in 11 years. So as slow as the Bank of Canada was in raising rates, they were still quicker than some other central banks, and notably the European Central Bank.
I guess not being last counts for something in some circles. But the other thing I wanted to say is you mentioned earlier that you felt that the bank had not signaled to the government that they should tighten fiscal policy. What are your thoughts on the appropriateness of that? I mean, we hear a lot about the independence of the bank and that the bank operates monetary policy separately from fiscal policy. They have to coordinate, of course, but they're not an elected institution. So is it appropriate for the bank to be sort of suggesting to the elected branch of government how they should be conducting fiscal policy?
Well, I'd agree with that it's not the bank's job to tell the government of Canada what to do with fiscal policy. But on the other hand, they should not be facilitating irresponsible fiscal policy either. They don't have to tell the government what to do in fiscal policy, but they can simply say, tell the government that we are going to start raising interest rates. It might be more than you were planning for in your budget. And you should be aware of the impact this is going to have on both the economy in terms of slower growth and for government finances in terms of higher debt payments. There's nothing wrong with the bank saying, we have an inflation mandate and we are going to fulfill that mandate irrespective of the consequences for your fiscal policy. That's not undemocratic. That's not telling the government what to do. It is simply the bank responsibly acknowledging the mandate to keep inflation at 2% that it had negotiated with the democratically elected government going back to, I believe, 1994.
Welcome back to Art Canada, Our Future. We're talking inflation with Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Philip, we've been talking a lot about the Bank of Canada and their past mistakes. I think it's fair to say they didn't get it right. But what, in your view, have they been making up for lost time with these large interest rate hikes? Is there anything else they can be doing or should be doing to help tackle inflation now?
I think they're on the right path. Their job is complicated by the fact that the dollar remains quite weak. If the dollar had been rising as it normally does with high energy prices, that would dampen import prices and make the Bank of Canada's job easier. But clearly, despite the boom we're seeing in oil and gas prices, we're not seeing the inflow of investment into Canada that would normally accompany an energy boom, because investors don't think that this government is going to allow the proper development of oil and gas and allow it to reach markets where it can get a high price. So the Bank of Canada's job is complicated by a lot of the mistakes we're seeing in government policy. So they're doing the best they can with the tools that are available to them, and with the frankly the policies, the unhelpful policies that many governments across this country are adopting and making it more difficult to lower prices.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. The impact now of the bank raising interest rates is, of course, for example, anyone who owns a home through a variable rate mortgage is paying more interest. This has put a squeeze on a lot of people. It's led to a lot of politicians starting to talk about how to offer relief for those rising prices. But the challenge, of course, is the more money you pour in, you pour more fuel on the fire that is the problem in the first place. So, what is your view on some of the political responses that are being proposed in terms of trying to help Canadians endure or sort of mitigate the damage or the impact of these higher prices?
Yeah. Well, we've seen a lot of governments, and not just the federal government, which promised nearly $9 billion of relief to Canadian households in the spring budget. But we saw in Quebec and Ontario, those governments mailed basically $500 to every household. Alberta / gas taxes, that's becoming increasingly popular. And all of these are obviously well-intentioned. They're trying to help people. But, we talked at the beginning about how the core cause of inflation is this imbalance between demand and supply. And, every action we take that boosts demand further is just going to, frankly, in the long run, worsen the inflationary pressures. The best thing governments could do would be to boost supply. But as I said there, the problem is that, that's going to take years to, for example, change regulations that make it easier to build housing in the Toronto area, or allow more interprovincial trade, or try to do things that would boost investment in oil and gas. All of these would take time. So, there isn't a lot governments can do right now. That's why it's very much up, the Bank of Canada is, as the saying goes, the only game in town when it comes to fighting inflation. It's their responsibility. The organization has a responsibility to control inflation. And at this point, they're the only organization that is even capable and determined to start to bring prices under control.
I wanted to get your thoughts on, I think you've probably already answered it by saying the bank is the only game in town, but in a lot of cases, the prescription is for governments to help tamp down demand by cutting back spending. But in this case, as you noted, with the pandemic spending, a lot of this money has just ended up in Canadians' bank accounts. So it's not really within the government's control to withdraw that potential demand. Do you think that complicates things in terms of what a normal response might be for a government trying to reduce demand?
Oh, very much so. Chrystia Freeland in her spring budget talked about how all these savings, the Bank of Canada estimates it's somewhere in the order of $200 to $300 billion. All these savings that Canadians built up during the pandemic, she called preloaded stimulus. The problem is, the government does not control the dispensation of that stimulus. Households do. And it seems now, for example, clear that Canadians, after 3 years of being cooped up, are very determined to travel. That they're, no matter what the price of gasoline or aviation fuel, they're going to fly and they're going to travel this summer because they've been cooped up for 3 years. And that's one reason why prices are energy prices are proving to be so sticky. Normally when you see $2 a liter gasoline prices, you'd start seeing demand starting to fall, but households are proving quite resilient, and that's helping to keep prices high and making it more difficult to bring down prices in the short term.
Yeah, great thoughts, Philip. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking inflation with Philip Cross, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Philip, we've talked a lot about the Bank of Canada and the federal government's fiscal policy. I wanted to touch on a related issue. You talked about the government's need to help improve supply and how that takes a long time. And a related issue is economic growth. I think you've written quite at length that this government is more consumed with redistribution than with growth. What are some examples of this, you think, over the term of this government in office? In what ways have they been, if not supportive of growth, anti-growth?
Well, a lot of my fundamental criticism is the words this government uses, the way they talk to the business community. It's hardly surprising that we're seeing a severe slump in business investment in this country that basically began in 2015 and continues to this day. For example, during the pandemic, the Prime Minister, even as he was handing out hundreds of billions of dollars to households, he only warned businesses and said, you better not abuse this money. You better be responsible in applying for it. And most of the abuse that was going on was on the household side, but he never told households, do not be irresponsible in applying for or spending this money. We're in the middle of the most severe recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Businesses were feeling threatened left and right, and instead of giving encouraging words, we were telling businesses to behave. And this government certainly is capable of giving encouraging words to people. You look at the way it talks to households, but also how it talks to civil servants. It talks to civil servants as, these unheralded frontline workers, and and all of which is true. But we needed that type of encouragement, that kind of positive environment to also be extended to the business community. And instead, we just see an unrelenting cold shoulder, or in the case of the oil and gas sector and many resource sectors, frankly, just a constant demonization.
Right. Yeah. And it's fair to say the government has played favorites with some sectors over others. What are some of the things that you might recommend, this government or a future government could do to sort of try and bring back some confidence in the business sector, try and bring back some incentive for investment and a more pro-growth agenda?
Well, I think some of the talk that we're seeing from, for example, the Ontario and Quebec governments, it's quite notable that the Quebec government, over half of the Quebec cabinet is made up of businessmen and entrepreneurs. Doug Ford in Ontario is quite open about talking about, opening that Ontario is open for business again. We could be doing things most dramatically. As I say, this government has done things to discourage the oil and gas sector. Obviously, the world at this point, and especially Europe, is facing a major energy crisis, a dramatic shortfall of supply entering the winter. We should be doing things to encourage oil and gas development in this country and helping get those supplies to Europe where it's critically needed. So that would be some of the things. Another very obvious one is reducing interprovincial trade barriers. This is something that we've been talking about as a nation for decades. Everybody talks about it. It's hypocritical for us to, we have a free trade agreement with all the other G7 nations. We're the only nation that does so. And yet it's easier for us for businesses in this country to trade with other countries than to trade at times with across provincial borders. This is something the federal government controls and has the power to implement. We've asked provinces to do this on their own. They clearly are not going to do the job. So this is another area where the federal government could take the lead in. A further area would be in, obviously, municipalities are very dependent on federal and provincial governments for funding. We could be making, reducing restrictions on housing supply a condition of many cities receiving funding. So, there's any number of things this government could do to send the message that this country is open to business again, and that would boost business investment and start to free up the supply side, the potential growth of this economy, which has been missing for nearly a decade now.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Philip, for joining us. These are great thoughts. Inflation and the cost of living is a huge issue for a lot of Canadians, and hopefully there are better days around the corner. Thank you all for watching. This is Our Canada, Our Future. We'll see you on the next episode.